computer recording light on. So hello, today I have Amy Berger with me, and she is the author of the book, The Alzheimer's Antidote, which is a fabulous book. And she also has the blog at To It in Nutrition, which you can find online, of course, and absolutely fabulous writer. She brings things down to a level that a lay person can really understand, which I really appreciate, because I think it's really important to understand how your body works. So we're going to talk a little bit about Alzheimer's today. And one of my favorite things that she says in her book, and she really just comes out of the gate with it, is that your brain is an energy hog. So speak to us about that.
Right. So the brain it has a very, very high energy demand, right? 24/7, even when you're sleeping, even when you're just laying on the couch watching TV, your brain is doing all kinds of things that you're not even consciously aware of. And so any disruption in either the fuel supply getting to the brain or the brain's ability to use that fuel is going to have major catastrophic implications for cognitive function, for thinking, for memory, for behavior. And that is the problem in Alzheimer's disease. The brain of somebody with Alzheimer's disease is not properly using glucose specifically. It's I say it that Alzheimer's disease is a metabolic problem, and by metabolic, that means it has to do with the way the brain is using energy. So it basically in Alzheimer's, your brain is starving to death. To put it in plain English, the brain it's not getting enough energy. It's a fuel crisis in the brain. And as a result, the neurons, the cells are not talking to each other properly. And the result of that is the memory loss, the cognitive impairment, the disease of Alzheimer's is the lack of energy in the brain. It's the brain energy starvation. The memory loss and the personality changes, those are the symptoms.
All right. So usually people start having mild symptoms early on. And I did read in your book that as early as our 30s and 40s, we can see changes in the brain that look like the progression of memory loss or Alzheimer's.
Right. And people need to know this because, nobody wakes up all of a sudden with Alzheimer's disease. It actually, the precursor is called mild cognitive impairment because when I said there's a fuel shortage, it's specific to glucose. It's that the brain, for whatever reason, is not able to properly break down and metabolize glucose and convert it into energy. And the decline in this brain glucose use is measurable by PET scan in people as young as their 30s and 40s, like you said. The thing is, though, when people are that young, they have no signs and symptoms. Their brain is still compensating. Even though the fuel use in the brain is already starting to decline, they have no issues with cognition, with memory. It's only when the problem has gone on for long enough and that the damage is widespread enough that you can no longer compensate. And that's when you start showing the early memory loss and the problems. But the thing is, by the time that happens, this disease process has been going on for many years. And it's like, by the time you even get that first sign, you're already pretty far along in the process, which I think is why it's so insidious. You don't even know it's going on.
So it's very similar to metabolic syndrome with type 2 diabetes, where for years you've had underlying hyperinsulinemia, you've been shuttling sugars you've been glycating your cells, this and that, and then you get the high blood sugar. But it's been going on beneath the detection for years before you get that high A1C.
Exactly. The high blood sugar in type 2 diabetes is like the last sign. It's a late indicator. And in Alzheimer's disease, I'm glad you said diabetes. They actually call Alzheimer's disease now type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain. And that's because of this problem using glucose in the brain. But, we chatted earlier. I guess your listeners and viewers know about the work of Joseph Kraft, who uncovered the problem of quite literally millions of people that have totally normal blood sugar, blood glucose, but they have very high insulin. so that whether it's the fasting glucose or the A1C, or even your response to the oral glucose tolerance test, those things are normal because the high insulin is keeping it in check. And so in Alzheimer's, even though we call it type 3 diabetes, you don't have to have type 2 diabetes to get Alzheimer's disease. Now, having type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome are major, major risk factors. You are more likely to get Alzheimer's disease if you have type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, but you can absolutely have Alzheimer's disease without the high blood sugar. In fact, there was a study they did none of this is new. One of these studies was from the early 2000s, and which is already 20 years ago. I can't believe it. But they did a study where they followed a cohort of people, and the people who had the highest risk for Alzheimer's disease were people who did not have diabetes because their blood sugar was normal, but they had high insulin.
So these would be like I used to be, hangry all the time, the people that our blood sugar would go up and our insulin then compensates and then brings our sugar down rapidly so that we go below our baseline. And we can kind of tell sometimes by symptoms like that, where we say, oh, I need to eat sugar because I get low blood sugar.
Yeah, either hypoglycemia or any of the like huge array of other things that are either caused by or made worse by the high insulin, even when the glucose is normal. And this could be non-alcoholic fatty liver, PCOS, high blood pressure, abdominal obesity. So even if you have thin arms and legs, but you've got kind of a big tummy, erectile dysfunction in men that have no other known cause of it, enlarged prostate gland, skin tags. There's all kinds of things that come from high insulin that you would never know because very few doctors measure insulin levels. Very few labs test insulin as a routine measure. And, something you and I talked about earlier is that this has nothing to do with body weight, right? Like type 2 diabetes and obesity go hand in hand so often that they call it diabesity, except all of these things, Alzheimer's disease, fatty liver, PCOS, hypoglycemia, can happen in people at any weight, right? When we have chronically high insulin, some people become heavy, some people don't. Some people don't become heavy, but they might have all kinds of other problems.
So this kind of blows the whole I'm thin, I can eat anything I want theory out of the water.
if only it were that simple.
And I really do think that holds a lot of people back from truly vibrant health. And it's so easy to kind of just live for today and not look down the road 20 years from now and think, how do I want my life to be when I reach this age or that age? Do I want to be able to tie my own shoes? Do I want to be at the mercy of other people to make decisions for me? I used to work in a nursing home, and I was a nurse, and I worked in Alzheimer's units, and it is so sad to watch people slip away and watch their families not even be able to grieve them as their body is still there, but their mind is gone. And then when they do pass, there's a very, I think, a very hard grief that goes with that, because you've really essentially been abstaining from grieving for years. And
and I think it's for some of those families, it's almost a relief because it's such a difficult situation, and it's so just painful, emotionally painful to watch your parent or your spouse or somebody deteriorate like that. It's almost, and the caregivers, the toughest job in Alzheimer's disease is being the caregiver. And so the burden, whether it's an emotional burden or a financial burden, some people have to quit their job to assume a full-time caregiving role. I mean, this is a tsunami, the likes of which we have never seen. I mean, as my dad is in his 70s, as that boomer generation gets older and older, this is only going to get worse. And like we were saying earlier, this is not a disease of elderly people. They used to joke and call it old timers disease, right? But now it's happening to people in their 50s and 60s. And to me, that's not old. I'm in my 40s now. The older I get, the younger those ages seem. And so, we can't say, oh, well, this is normal, you're just getting older. It's not normal. And, you could accept it as being somewhat reasonable in someone in their late 80s or 90s to start getting a little fuzzy headed. But for someone in their 50s and 60s, this is not, it's not normal. And the rate of this is increasing in parallel with type 2 diabetes, with metabolic syndrome, with all that stuff. And that's not a coincidence. And in fact, you know, we talked about type 3 diabetes. The connections between metabolic syndrome and Alzheimer's or cognitive impairment are so strong, and that whole metabolic mess is such a strong risk factor for Alzheimer's, they actually call it metabolic cognitive syndrome now. And you can look
Wow.
that up on PubMed. I didn't create that phrase. I wish I did, because it's brilliant, but this is like, they know this. Why is this information not trickling down to the average family doctor's office, the average neurologist's office? When you go on the Alzheimer's Association's website, there is zero mention of the brain glucose problem, or of, it's unreal to me. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I refuse to believe that the PhDs and MDs, like the world's experts working for this organization, don't know that that's the problem.
Right. And I would say that, you know, my husband's an interventional cardiologist, and I recently saw where they're having a metabolic specialist. And my husband has said to me, as an interventional cardiologist, he actually feels like he's really dealing with, he's more of a diabetes doctor, because almost all heart disease, everything is metabolically ignited. It's the
Right.
storm of all of these things happening, the high blood pressure, the abdominal girth, the you know, not being able to control your blood sugars, all of these things come together. And of course, this is hardening of your arteries. This is glycation, which, you know, speak to that briefly. And then I'd really like to, you know, to get to what can we do to prevent this? And does this coincide, just quickly, does it coincide with the food pyramid that came out in 1977? Because I know we didn't have high fructose, or I call it high fructose fatty liver disease, but we didn't have fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, prior to the 1990s. And that was shortly
Right.
after we switched over to a high carb, lower fat way of eating.
Right. That's a really good question. I don't know when exactly it started to accelerate with Alzheimer's disease. Now, you could argue that because we do have a baby boom generation and we have a larger population that's reaching those older years, of course we're going to have a higher incidence of a disease that tends to afflict more older people. But again, we're not talking about old people anymore. We're talking about people in their 40s, 50s, 60s. So I definitely think there is something with the diet. I mean, this disease is definitely increasing, and it's hitting people younger, just like type 2. Like, type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset,
Yeah.
because little kids, if a little kid had diabetes, it was always type 1, which is something very different from like the type 2 we're discussing. And so if you had diabetes when you were an adult, it was type 2. But now little kids get it, toddlers get it. Toddlers have non-alcoholic fatty liver now. I mean,
Yeah.
so this is not, it's not really age specific. And it can't be genetic, because our genes haven't changed that much in the last 30 or 40 years, right? They've
Yeah.
changed probably not at all. There's something else going on here. It's got to be something environmental, dietary. Some people think there might be like an infectious angle to Alzheimer's. You know, maybe there is, but and I should say that there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot of unanswered questions, but just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we don't know anything. And I think we have enough information to at least start taking some kind of action. And the food, you know, the food pyramid, I don't know if I could put the blame on the food pyramid or in conjunction with fear mongering about red meat, especially red meat, because of the iron content, because of the saturated fat content, because of whatever reason people are inventing why this is supposedly bad for us. That has been absolutely debunked over and over and over again. There is no connection whatsoever between saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease. And with those fears though, with people cutting way back on those foods, what are we also eating a lot less of? Vitamin B12,
Right.
something that is absolutely crucial for a healthy brain, right? We were supposed to go low fat, and until recently, it was all fat. You're supposed to keep all fat low. Now it's, what Sally Fallon from the Weston Price Foundation calls the politically correct fats. Oh, it's okay to eat salmon, it's okay to eat walnuts, so at least we're getting those omega-3s. But then back in the day when all fat was demonized, we weren't even getting the omega-3s, which is a fat, which is also crucial for the brain. We have all of these, just all of these nutrients, choline, which the richest source of choline is egg yolks. And
Yes.
how many people were living on egg white omelets through the whole 80s and 90s?
Yes.
So
It's
it, it,
interesting.
it kind of goes hand in hand, that high carb, base your diet on grains and starches, and also reduce consumption of foods that are the richest in some of these nutrients that are so critical for the brain.
Well, I'll tell you, my total cholesterol at one point was like around 190, but my triglycerides were super high and my HDLs were very low, like in the 20s, I think. And now
Wow.
my HDLs are in their 80s and my triglycerides are like around 30. And my HDLs or my my LDLs are really high.
Mm-hmm.
And my total cholesterol is like 280 or something like that. But my husband, a cardiologist, almost cried because he thinks my ratios are so beautiful and he doesn't feel the need to put me on something
Good.
to
Well,
correct.
I'm glad he understands how to look at all the moving pieces. You don't just look at LDL and freak out. You look
Right.
at the full spectrum of what's going on.
And he's pretty sure that my LDLs would be in good ratios because there's different particle sizes and things in there too. Because he's
Right.
also looking at what is my hemoglobin A1C, what is this, what is that? So he's looking at the full picture, which I think a lot more doctors are beginning to do that regularly, which I'm thrilled about because that means so much to our health. Because if a doctor can tell you, just quit drinking liquid sugar, have eggs and bacon for breakfast, just those two things alone are going to promote health drastically.
Yeah, honestly, we'll talk about like diet in a bit. Not everyone needs to do an extreme, a radical diet change. For some people, just getting rid of the most obvious junk goes a very long way.
Well, and then so there's another fuel source that we can use to feed our brain. And that's where a low carb diet comes in. If you are experiencing these memory losses or you do have a strong history of Alzheimer's disease in your family, you might consider being a little more drastic. And why wouldn't you? Because as we said, who wants to live that way? You wouldn't wish
Right.
that on your worst enemy. So
Yeah.
when we talk about how ketones are made, or exogenous ketones that our own body produces, it's such a natural thing to be able to use ketones as fuel. We would have died off as a race if we weren't able to use an alternate fuel source. So
Yeah, it is natural, but it's not common today because everyone is, well, not everyone, so many people are eating such a high carbohydrate diet. And ketone, I'm sure your listeners know, but ketones are made as a byproduct of burning a lot of fat. And everyone thinks of insulin as a blood sugar hormone, but lowering blood sugar is only one of many, many different things that insulin does. Like, insulin is a hormone. If you think of testosterone or estrogen, they do a ton of different things throughout the body, and so does insulin. One of the biggest, most powerful things insulin does is inhibit fat burning. It literally is like a security guard standing outside fat cells that doesn't let the fat out to go be burned somewhere else. That's why so many of us had such a hard time losing weight when we were eating a high carb diet. That was me. I got into low carb and keto because of my own struggles with weight. And I thought I was doing all the right things, lots and lots of exercise, my skim milk on my whole grain cereal and light margarine on my whole wheat toast. And it wasn't until I dropped the carbs that I started to lose the body fat. But if if the problem in Alzheimer's disease is that the brain, for whatever reason, is no longer metabolizing glucose properly, we need to give it some other fuel. The brain is starving. Can we nourish it? Can we feed it something else? Yeah. One of the most promising areas of research right now in Alzheimer's disease is that even though the brain is not able to use glucose properly, it can still take up and use ketones. And we know this, it's not just in rats, it's not just in Petri dish studies, but they've done the research in human beings with Alzheimer's or with the mild cognitive impairment. And it's not a slam dunk. It doesn't restore cognition to 100%, but my goodness, it improves it noticeably in most people. And the fact that there is any improvement at all should be reason to be really excited and really, optimistic. And the problem is, like you were saying, well, ketones, we would have died out long ago. It's a totally natural thing. Most people, after weaning of breastfeeding when they were an infant, most people are almost never in ketosis because we're eating so much carbohydrate and our insulin is high all the time. So we're never really burning a lot of fat. And to be clear, it's not binary. It's not like you're burning 100% glucose and zero fat or 100% fat and zero. It's always a little bit of everything. But if you're eating a very high carb diet, your insulin is high most of the time, most of your body is running on glucose and a little bit of fat.
Right.
And so you're just not producing a whole lot of ketones. And some, most people wake up in the morning in a ketogenic state because let's say you had dinner even if you had dinner at 7 or 8 p.m., you've gone many hours without eating. So that by the time you wake up in the morning, you might be very mildly in ketosis. But then what happens? You have your cereal, you have your orange juice, your bran muffin, and forget it. No more ketones for the whole rest of the day.
Right. And then you have a snack 2 hours later, and then
right.
you have, and then the frequency of eating is part of the problem too, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's I have a great aunt, she's 105 and she has her faculties like you wouldn't believe. Wow. And she grew up, she went and got the eggs from the chicken. She wrung the chicken's neck. She saw the face of the cow she ate. Everything was super high fat. And yes, she had carbs in her diet. Mm-hmm. They usually had dessert a couple of times a week, but they made their own bread. So they didn't eat, tons of it because it was a lot of work to make bread on a cook stove. They didn't have, rural power out here in the middle of Nebraska until the mid 1940s. So you can see, and we all know older people that they only eat 3 meals a day. They don't snack. That's how they were raised.
Yeah. And when these people grew up, the whole food landscape was completely different. I mean, now you go to the shoe store and they have candy at the checkout. You go to the electronics store and there's a huge display of junk food to buy. Like, I'm here to buy a television set. Why are there gummy bears for sale? I mean, it's America, like literally free country where we can do what we want to do. But there's food available all the time and it's so cheap. I feel like in our grandparents' day and our great-grandparents' day, it was harder to procure that stuff and it was so much more expensive. You'll hear stories. I don't know that this was necessarily my grandparents, but I've heard stories from people where their Christmas present was an orange because it was so rare. Like, oh my God, it's a citrus fruit. Like, we never get this stuff in this part of the country. Like, wow, my orange once a year.
My father was raised in Brooklyn, New York, and he would have been 95 this year. And he said an orange was a rare treat. You got that and a $1 bill for Christmas.
Right. And instead of being able to drink the equivalent of 8 oranges in 10 seconds in a glass.
Right. So the way we eat has changed. And with that, our metabolic flexibility or our ability to use 2 fuel sources has changed. But we can have a lot of impact on that by how we eat and what we eat. And we can actually impact the way our mitochondria behave through our mouths and through like when we spoke earlier, getting a really good night's sleep, restorative sleep, movement. And I know you mentioned, some people are in a wheelchair. Well, even people in wheelchairs can do a lot of activity. You can lift your arms up and down if you're mobile at all. You can find some way to be active without having it to be like a big exercise program. None of that is necessary. It's not necessary to rearrange your whole entire life to be able to eat differently. You can do it a little tiny teaspoon at a time. I know one thing that I have my clients do is just quit eating quit having any liquid sugar to begin with, and then switch over from cereals and grains and things and have a really good low carb breakfast.
Yeah,
You have
there are
3 meals a
people,
day.
yeah, some people want to go keto and they want to dive in immediately and it's great. They never have any problem. They never look back. For some people, like, I can't do it. It's so hard. You can do it little by little. I'll tell some people, like what you said is a great idea. First, don't change anything about your diet except the liquid sugar. No more drinking sugar, but everything else keep the same, and then keep changing it over time. And I'll tell people something similar, like, okay, for the first week, change nothing except don't eat bread. You can still have your pasta, your rice, your beans, your fruit, just no bread. The next week, no bread and no pasta. You can still have your rice, your beans, your fruit, but each week you take something out. And so the change was much more gradual and maybe not as jarring or not as unthinkable or as undoable. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And depending on your health situation, the more compromised your health is, the more dramatic a change you're probably going to need to really dig out of that and feel better. If you already feel well and you just want to keep feeling well, you might not need something so extreme. There's a lot of people who I think do very well on more of like a paleo diet, which is not low carb or ketogenic by definition, because you can still have your fruit, your starchy root vegetables. It's no grain and no beans, but so you can have a fair bit of carbohydrate, but you're not eating the abject garbage. And for some people, that's enough to like put an autoimmune condition into remission, or even for some people to improve the blood sugar. Some people have to take things that extra step and go, lower carb or full on ketogenic.
And I think there's enough evidence to suggest that doing some kind of a keto reset, like Mark Sisson suggests, doing like a 12-week keto reset once or twice in your lifetime can actually upregulate better genes, better gene expression, that kind of thing. And then, you can also kind of revisit things or do like an 80-20, 80-10, where you can go out and have like share a dessert on the weekend with someone if you're not metabolically compromised. It doesn't have to be, you're not getting a tattoo for life, but I do suggest to people, what have you got to use by trying something different, and use your own feedback. How do you feel? I know I had a client a couple of years ago who she's in her 50s and she was so worried about her memory. And I didn't really believe her. I thought maybe she was exaggerating until her husband told me she is not exaggerating. I'm super worried. And so we did kind of rip the Band-Aid with her, and her memory improved so much. And the relief for her, she's actually running her own business now, just a small home business that she dreamt about for, her whole life. And she was unafraid to go ahead and pursue that now that her, her brain was getting that nourishment. So I've seen with my own eyes that, this can work. Now, does it work for everyone? I don't think we could say that. Like you said, it depends. Where are they on the spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, they're doing some clinical trials of, I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Dale Bredesen, and, he wrote a book called The End of Alzheimer's, and it's, people are mixed on how they feel about him and his protocol, but he is definitely having some very favorable results with people, but you have to be serious about it. You can't kind of just dip your toes in the water. If you're really starting to be impaired, you have to make some radical changes. And I think the more severe the situation is, it's not a slam dunk that this is not a miracle cure for Alzheimer's. Like, please, nobody come away thinking that I'm trying to claim that this is a cure for Alzheimer's. It's not. But what the ketogenic diet does, or maybe we can talk about exogenous ketones in a minute.
Yes.
What any kind of ketogenic type therapy or intervention will do is at least close that fuel gap. We know the brain is starving and it can't use glucose. Can we give it something else? Yes, ketones. Okay. Now what? Or that's the problem in Alzheimer's disease. We don't know why it's happening. We don't know why the brain has lost that ability. We could speculate. We could speculate about the modern diet, the lack of critical nutrients and stuff like that. But
especially B12, which you mentioned.
Yeah. And it's, I just think this right now is the single most promising avenue, because everything else has failed, right? Every single drug that has been developed for Alzheimer's disease so far, either at best, the very best case scenario, it slows the decline. It doesn't stop it, and it doesn't pull this disease back. It makes you get worse more slowly, but you still get worse. And worst case scenario, some of these drugs, the clinical trials had to be stopped because patients on the drug were doing worse than the subjects on the placebo. So, we're chasing a lot of the wrong targets. What these drugs target are the amyloid plaques and the tangles and these buzzwords that you hear, but yet every single drug, and these are multi-million-dollar efforts to develop drugs for this disease, they have all been an utter failure. We need to look elsewhere for answers, because and thankfully it's starting to come out even in the mainstream press that there's something about blood sugar, there's something about glucose, and you're starting to see even more articles acknowledge that amyloid hypothesis, is probably not what we thought it was, because we've been researching this for decades. We've been going after it with everything we have, and every effort has failed.
So
and when you're chasing the wrong
focus,
target, guess what? It is going to fail.
right. So basically, when we focus solely on these amyloid plaques, we're not dealing with the energy issue, and we're still trying to drive a car with an empty tank.
Right.
So introducing ketones into this mix gives us an alternate fuel source. And ketones are your brain's preferred fuel, aren't they?
Yeah, I think the word preferred is a little funny, because it just depends. A lot of people will say that glucose is the preferred fuel. And I think they say preferred because it's like, whatever, if you have two things available and the brain takes one of them first, that must be the preferred fuel. But if that's and I do agree that the brain sort of likes ketones better than glucose, but if that's our judge of what the body's preferred fuel is, then the body's preferred fuel is ethanol from beer, wine, liquor, from alcohol, because that's burned first. I don't think it's the body's preferred.
No.
So the word preferred is like a problem, but I know what you're saying. I mean, the burning, if you look at the cellular level, like the biochemical level, the burning of ketones and fatty acids is less damaging than the burning of glucose. If you think of it like the brain is a hybrid car, it can run on different kinds of fuel. One fuel sort of produces more pollution, if you will, than the others. And the one that pollutes more and makes everything more damaged is glucose. So when you burn fatty acids or ketones, it's less. Just to say real quick about the exogenous ketones, if people are familiar with either MCT oil or coconut oil, with these special fatty acids that get more readily converted into ketones, even if somebody's eating a high carb diet,
yes,
MCT oil, those fats will still produce some ketones. Or you can actually just take a ketone supplement that usually comes in a powder that you can drink, and that will provide some fuel, because we just need ketones in the brain any way we can get them. But if the problem is happening because of a whole body-wide systemic metabolic problem, the outside ketones and the MCT oil are not going to correct the problem. The ketogenic diet or a low-carb diet will. That will affect the body wholesale, whereas just giving the ketones is like putting a Band-Aid. It's like, okay, I fixed the symptom. Remember, the memory loss is the symptom.
yes.
I fixed the symptom. The disease is still going on. It's like, everyone uses this analogy because it's so good. It's like putting duct tape or electrical tape over your check engine light. Hey, I can't see the light anymore. The light's still on. You just can't see it because you've covered it up.
Well, and I find it very interesting too. Like for myself, I kind of go back and forth with my fat. Sometimes I lower it, sometimes I raise it up. And right now with all the stress with COVID, my husband's a doctor. We've got a lot of it in town. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to end up being a hot spot here in the Midwest. And we have meat packing plants where several people have been diagnosed, and lots of immigrants. And the underlying stress, I just feel better having more fat. So I'm finding myself having my bulletproof coffee in the morning and maybe even a tea with extra coconut oil in it. And I just feel soothed. And I don't know if that's, fats are so important and such a building block of our nervous system. I don't know if that's part of it, but my cravings go down. I don't crave sweets. And I consider myself a food addict, a sugar, starch, processed food addict. So it's really helped me to just like keep my fats higher right now. And I think it is the ketones.
It probably is the key. The ketones are very like calming and therapeutic for the brain. And I say calming, but not sleepy calming, more like, because a lot of people specifically use the MCT oil because it gives them kind of a boost, like a cognitive boost. So I don't mean like I'm awake. It's more like a clearing of the cobwebs kind of a thing. And I know for mood, a lot of people that tend toward either anxiety or depression, when the ketones are a little higher, most people, not all, but most people find that their mood is more even and just a more positive outlook. And you can, real quick, you can get away with it. Clearly, I can't see your whole body. You don't look like you have a weight problem, but there are, you look great.
55.
You look great. And,
I don't know what I weigh, but I'm a size 4 and I'm 5'4". So I'm
size 4, you definitely don't have a weight problem. But there are some people out there who struggle with losing body fat. And it's in some cases, they are overdoing the fat.
Yes.
What gets your body to transition from the glucose burning state or the primarily glucose burning state to the primarily fat burning state is not eating tons and tons of fat. It's not eating the carbs.
Yes.
The absence of carbs is what makes ketosis happen, not the presence of fat. But once you are already in a low carb state like you are, then when you have MCT oil or something, you probably are going to have more ketones and maybe experience more of that kind of brain and mood boost, I think.
Well,
I see this all the time. People have a really hard time losing fat when they're overdoing fat if they are trying to lose weight.
Right. And you actually came out with a new ebook about weight loss stalls while we're on this topic, because I tell a lot of my clients, that you're either going to eat fat off of your plate or off of your body at some point. And I talk to them about, just closing down their window of eating, doing things like maybe a couple of times a week, a protein sparing modified fast kind of thing, where you're lowering your fat significantly to access stored body fat, that kind of thing. So I'm interested to hear about your new ebook.
Yeah, thank you. It is called The Stall Slayer, and people can find it at stallslayer.com. And it is about breaking fat loss stalls on low carb or ketogenic diets, because that's the most common reason people contact me for help. Most people that write to me are already doing low carb or keto and they're just not getting the result they want. And 9 times out of 10, the result they want is to lose body fat. And right now it's a PDF. It's just an ebook, so you can read it electronically, or if you want to read it in a hard copy, just print it out. Buy the PDF and print it out. There is a print on demand and Kindle version coming. I don't know when that's going to happen, but it will be on Amazon eventually. But there's numerous reasons why people kind of get hung up with the fat loss, but that's one of the biggest ones I see, is because people who are new to this, you and I talked earlier, we are both fortunate in that we came into low carb and keto like several years back. Before, when I was new, I'm such an old veteran at this, Reddit, Twitter, YouTube didn't even exist. I don't even think Facebook existed when I was brand new to this. So there wasn't all this confusion. There wasn't conflicting and different information coming in from all sides. And so now, if you're new to this, you might stumble across, Joe Blow's website, and he says you have to eat 80% fat. You have to have these ratios or these macros. And it doesn't work that way. There's no magical math that
people think the keto diet is something outside of you, but the keto diet is just referring to the body's ability to produce ketones.
Right.
And that is when we lower our insulin enough in order to access that fat storage. And that's where we get our ketones from. So it's nice to transition into a keto diet, to add high fats to help you have that energy and transition into it. Mm-hmm. And then if you ask me, we have to think about, scarcity. Like we're designed for scarcity. So some days maybe your fat is a higher intake. Maybe you have a stressful situation coming up or something and you want to access a higher ketone level, or you're just hungrier that day. There's no reason not to have a little extra protein or fatty protein or something. And then another day, maybe you just mimic that where we would have been a little bit in a starvation mode and lower that fat down. And I think that keeps your body just kind of humming along the way it's supposed to. And it helps with all kinds of processes like autophagy, which is something that we haven't discussed, which I'm sure helps with keeping the plaques the right size instead of the overgrown plaques that you see in Alzheimer's.
Well, I think, what was I going to say? It's so interesting to me that people always want, well, how many calories should I be eating? Or what should my macros be? I'm like, everybody's so enamored with kind of mimicking the way we would have evolved or how our ancestors ate. Do we think that our ancestors ate the exact same amount of food every single day, 365, whether it was freezing cold out or 98 degrees, and like we were talking earlier, I love food. I refuse to sit down to a meal and open up my spreadsheet and open up my app and track it. I'm not going to do it. And now, can that be useful? Yeah. If you're a data-driven person and you like those numbers, do it. I'm not opposed to doing it for other people who like it. I don't want to do it. And the beauty of keto is that when you do it right, you don't have to worry about all the math and the numbers. And and I think you're right. Some days you're going to be hungrier. Whether a woman, depending on where you are in your cycle, you're ravenous or you're not hungry. And, depending on if you've spent 3 days like me sitting on your butt in front of a computer, not that you shouldn't be hungry, but are you going to have the same appetite as if you are training for a triathlon and you're out there running 3 hours a day?
Exactly.
And with regard to, I think with autophagy, there's so much that we don't know. And it's not so much a binary, like you're either clearing out old cells and old debris or you're getting sick. Right. There's a spectrum. Autophagy, which is, so people don't, it's the clearing out of old, worn out cellular gunk and debris. It literally means self-eating, autophagy. So like the body kind of gobbling up these bits and pieces to get rid of them. And it happens all the time. It just happens more when the body needs to do it more. Like if you're fasting or something and, okay, I'm not eating, there's no food coming in yet, I still need to power all the processes in my body. I still need fats, I still need amino acids, I still need glucose. Where am I going to get it from? I guess I might as well break down all this old junk. Like Jason Fung is always says, that's like, I don't know. He has this example because people are so worried about losing protein and losing muscle. Yeah.
It's not.
Why would you break down all your muscle when you've got all this like firewood and all this old debris that you could burn instead?
And interestingly, he was on the national news this morning.
I heard, I have a clip, I haven't watched it yet. Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, Jason Fung is on national TV. How cool is that?
That's kind of a big deal.
It's a big deal to me. I was just like, my husband hands out a slip of paper, go get Jason Fung's Obesity Code, go get Jason Fung's, give my wife a call. I do a free consultation. Mm-hmm. I spend an hour and a half with someone with their full intake form, and I guarantee them I will point their feet in the right direction whether they hire me or not, because I want my community to be healthy.
Right.
And that's the bottom line. And that's, I really appreciate you taking the time to be interviewed today. I just want to get people hooked up with people that I feel are trustworthy and that aren't, all hyperbole and there's only one way. And, I know everything. Everybody, there's a lot of people out there that want to be like a guru on the mount.
Unfortunately, I'm sure you see this as much as I do on social media. It's getting worse. That sort of polarization and the like, I'm staking my claim, and it's almost like a religious, puritanical thing. And it's not helping anyone because it actually turns people off to this rather than drawing them in.
I agree. And I think, we're adults. We can eat and live however we want to, and it shouldn't be something that we attack one another over. If we do have, concerns, then like I said earlier, it's not a tattoo. You can try a lifestyle on for size and see how it works for you. And
it's a temporary tattoo. Like when I was a little kid, the tattoos that came with the gum that you could just like wet it, and then it's a temporary tattoo.
I used to sell makeup, and women would just die if I wanted to try a different color lipstick on them. And I was like, come on, it's not a tattoo, just try it. And I feel the same way about, like, try lowering your carbs, try getting rid of the soda pop, which is bad for you. Right. No one should. It used to be in an 8-ounce bottle, and you got it on the 4th of July. You got soda pop, and now you see people hanging it on their baskets, and then underneath their cart is filled with it. And everything inside is carbs, carbs, carbs.
Yeah.
All I'm suggesting is that we eat natural foods, and try to stay as healthy as we can. And I think that that's the message that you're sending, as well as a lot of hope for regaining some cognitive function for people that have slipped down that slippery slope.
I certainly hope it helps. Like I said, I can't promise anything, but I think there's a scientific and biochemical rationale as to why having some way to produce ketones, it should help somewhat. And again, like we get B12, get replete in whatever critical nutrients you might be low in. And it couldn't hurt. It certainly couldn't hurt.
Well, and you did say earlier, and I'll just end with this, that you can get your own tests ordered nowadays. You can go online and have your B12 taken. You can find out what your numbers are and go from there. And there are doctors I know, even here in Grand Island, Nebraska, in the belly button of America, that will help you out with this.
The belly button of America, I love it.
And I have to say too, don't be afraid to tell your doctor, hey, if you have diabetes type 2 and your memory is slipping, you need your doctor's assistance. Yeah. And you don't need their permission to change what you're eating, but you do need to be honest with them and say, I'm going to try to lower my carbs, and I'd like to be in communication with you about my medications.
Yeah. Right. Especially if you're taking medication, especially for blood sugar or blood pressure, you need to be monitored. But if your doctor is uncooperative, there are websites where you can search for ketogenic friendly and low carb friendly doctors. Maybe I'll send you some links. We can maybe include those in the notes, but there might not be one in your area, but maybe there is. It's worth looking.
There's several in my area, I'm happy to say. So, and I think it's spreading like wildfire. Even my father-in-law, that's been practicing family medicine for 50 years, does intermittent fasting and is relatively low carb. So thank you so much, Amy. It's been wonderful chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. Take care.